So far in this journey through baseball's steroid myths, I've tried to stick to general claims. That is, claims about how steroids affected baseball as a whole, or the entire population of players. Those are the questions I'm comfortable with. Did steroids cause the league-wide increase in home runs? No. Did they cause a decrease in injuries or extend careers on the whole? No. You can look at the data and find answers to these big-picture questions. But I've tried to stay away from making any precise claims about how steroids affected any particular player's body. I've mentioned individual players, of course, as examples of general trends, but as far as making specific claims about how drugs impacted one player or another, that's a much harder question to answer, and I don't think it's really responsible for people to make judgments like that from afar. One of the things that drives me the craziest about steroid myths is when people say, with such certainty, that they just know how steroids affected a particular player's body or career. That's just stupid. Even experienced doctors can't always say with certainty how a drug will affect each individual patient, but some jerk watching baseball games on TV can tell. For one, we have very limited evidence about who was using what and when. Even for players who we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence that they did use illegal substances, we almost never have complete information about what type of regimen they were on. Even a player who failed a drug test and we know specifically what they took, we usually can't say for how long before that test that they were using. So any conclusions about how the drugs affected him are going to involve a great deal of speculation. And that's to say nothing of the dozens and dozens of guys who never failed any test or had any firm connections to PEDs and are only tied to steroids by rumors and innuendo that say nothing about the specific substances taken. But even if we had more definitive evidence about what each steroid user took and when they took it, it would still be hard to make claims about the effects of those drugs on each specific guy. After all, drugs don't affect everyone the same way. This is true of all kinds of drugs, from steroids to over-the-counter cold medicine. If you've ever had a serious medical issue, you might have some experience with how difficult it can be for a doctor to find the right combination of drugs to treat you specifically, even when the doctor has tons of experience treating other patients for the exact same ailments. Painkillers that work for some people don't work for others. Side effects that are marginal in some patients are debilitating in others. And that's when we're talking about common, well-tested drugs being used in a conventional manner, where we have tons of clinical data about the effects of something. Steroids aren't like that. These are drugs that are being used in non-standard ways, often with limited or no medical oversight, and the drugs are not being tested or seriously studied for these effects. So the idea that anyone can say with any certainty how performance-enhancing drugs affected a specific individual player is absurd to me. It's really one of the myths that inspired me to start this series in the first place. Unfortunately, though, fans have shaped their perceptions about these drugs around certain individuals who were caught or in some cases just suspected of using steroids. In other words, we think we know what steroids do because we think we know who used steroids and how they were helped by those drugs. It's really impossible to talk about PEDs without talking about the careers of people who supposedly used them, and not just in the aggregate, but as individuals. So for the next batch of videos, I'm going to go in a little more detail on individual careers that seem to have played an outsized role in shaping the steroid discourse, examining how those careers perpetuated certain myths that linger to this day. And for this video, I want to talk about my old nemesis, Manny Ramirez. As a Yankee fan of a certain age, Manny Ramirez was responsible for several of the worst moments of my life, as he was one of the best hitters of the so-called steroid era, and he hit more home runs against the Yankees than against any other team. First for Cleveland in the late 90s, and then for the Boston Red Sox in the early 2000s. But Ramirez is also known as one of the first guys to fail two separate steroid tests. First in May of 2009, and then in April of 2011. The last one basically ended his career, and he decided to retire rather than serve his suspension. But it was that first failed test, the 2009 one, that really shaped people's perceptions of how steroids work, because it came right around the time when Manny was undergoing something of a career renaissance. The year before, he and the Red Sox had a contentious breakup after 7.5 years together, including 2 World Series titles. But by 2008, Boston decided he was more trouble than he was worth, trading him to the Dodgers at the deadline. Ramirez then proceeded to have one of the hottest 2-month stretches of his career. First, he won the National League Player of the Month in August, and then he was almost as good in September. Overall, he hit .396 with 17 home runs with the Dodgers in just 53 games, powering them from just a .500 team at the time of the trade to first place in the NL West, and then a sweep of the Cubs in the division series. Manny was so good over those 2 months that he finished 4th in NL MVP voting despite only playing 53 games in the National League. Then, in 2009, after re-signing with the Dodgers, he got off to another hot start, hitting .372 in April, before failing a drug test the first week of May. As soon as that was announced, the conventional wisdom set in. Obviously, steroids had been the cause of his resurgence with the Dodgers. It was a perfect example of all our myths in action. First, that steroids increase your power, since Manny had a slugging percentage of around .700 with the Dodgers. And second, that steroids could reverse a career that was in decline, since Ramirez had gone from seemingly washed up with the Red Sox to an MVP candidate with the Dodgers. To this day, Manny's stretch with the Dodgers is one of the go-to examples for people who believe in the usefulness of steroids. The idea that steroids saved Manny's career would become an accepted fact, so much so that a couple years later, when Alex Rodriguez was looking to save his own career, he tracked down Manny's old steroid dealer, Anthony Bosch, and the first words out of A-Rod's mouth when he met Bosch were, "What did you give Manny Ramirez in 2008 and 2009? But this story ought to give us pause, because the only source for a lot of these claims about Manny's resurgence is Anthony Bosch. According to an ESPN story from just last year, Bosch says that Manny came to him saying, quote, "I can't pick up a bat." But Bosch is not a doctor or a reliable narrator. He's just a guy dressing in a white coat and running an illegal steroid business out of the back of a tanning salon in Florida. The truth is, Manny's suspension was great advertising for Bosch's clinic Biogenesis, and he would tell anyone who asked that he was responsible for Manny's career renaissance. Of course, the guy trying to sell you steroids is going to tell you how great steroids are for your career. If we actually look at reality, though, this narrative about steroids saving Manny's career is mostly bullshit. Let's start with the idea that Manny's career was on life support before he found Tony Bosch, when he supposedly couldn't pick up a bat. This is nonsense. 2007 was a down year for Manny Ramirez, but it was because of an injury. At the end of July, he was hitting over .300 with an on-base percentage over .400 and a slugging percentage over .500, on track for yet another year with 30 home runs and 100 RBIs. It wasn't a career year for a hitter as legendary as Manny, but he was still on pace to be one of the best hitters in the league. At the end of August, he strained his oblique and missed most of the rest of the season. And it seems he was hurt for about a month before that, too, because he hit with essentially no power in August of 2007, collecting only 2 home runs and seeing his slugging percentage fall by nearly 30 points. But by the time he came back for the postseason that year, Manny was fine. In 3 playoff series in 2007, Manny hit .348 with an on-base percentage of .508 and a slugging percentage of .652. He hit 4 home runs and reached base in 13 of Boston's 14 postseason games. Does that sound like someone who could hardly pick up a bat?
Left field, and the Red Sox are winners! Manny Ramirez with an absolute rocket into the Boston night, and the Red Sox lead the series 2 games to none. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning in Boston, and nobody's left, as Manny Ramirez sent one completely out of Fenway over the monster seats off one of the greatest closers in the game.
Well, here's a guy in Rodriguez that has one of the best curveballs in the game, but he tried to sneak one fastball by Ramirez on the inner portion, and that's where it wound up.
How's that oblique doing right now for Manny, huh?
I would say it's just fine.
And if you're wondering if the steroid use could explain the injury recovery, that doesn't really hold up either because A, Bosch claims he didn't meet Manny until after the 2007 season was over, and B, a strained oblique is a pretty normal injury, and the month or so that Manny missed is a pretty standard recovery time for an athlete, even without PEDs. And by 2008, Ramirez was really his old self. At the time Boston traded him, his OPS was .926. He was slashing .299, .398, .529. Those numbers were slightly below his career averages, but he would have finished about 12th in the American League in OPS had he finished the year with those numbers. And Ramirez was usually a player who played better in the second half, so they likely would have gone up anyway. In other words, Manny's numbers in 2008 were consistent with a great hitter having a gentle decline in his mid to late 30s. Boston didn't give up on him because he was washed up. They gave up on him because he was annoying. In 2008 alone, Manny Ramirez took a swing at his teammate Kevin Youkilis in the dugout, got into another physical altercation with Boston's 64-year-old traveling secretary, and then took himself out of the lineup with a phony injury because he was upset about his contract. Manny was always a moody player who was tough to get along with, and he demanded trades before, but this was the time the Red Sox finally decided they were done with him. Which leads to the second half of the Manny on steroids myth. Because even if he was still a great hitter in Boston, Ramirez did take it to another level in Los Angeles. Surely that was because of steroids, right? Well, maybe. Like I said, we can't really be sure about how any specific drug is going to affect any specific person. And since Manny did use drugs, we can't rule it out. But I am not convinced. For one, as I mentioned before, Manny usually played better in the second half of a season. Two, as I also mentioned before, Manny was a mercurial, streaky player who was fed up with Boston by the time he left. Is it so hard to believe that a change of scenery to sunny Los Angeles would cause him to get hot for a stretch of time? After all, that's what we're really talking about here. One crazy hot stretch. And Manny was really a great hitter who had hot stretches like that quite a lot. In May and June of 2006, for example, he hit .321 with 16 home runs and an on-base percentage of .450. In August and September of 2005, he hit .323 with 17 home runs and an on-base percentage of .400. His first 2 months in Boston back in 2001, after he first signed with the Red Sox, he hit 16 home runs and had a slugging percentage of .700. In other words, he had streaks like that a lot. So is it really so hard to believe that after wearing out his welcome in Boston, he would go to the Dodgers and lock in for a few months? Do we really need to invoke a chemical explanation for that? That was just the kind of player Manny was. It was just Manny being Manny. Now, if you're committed to finding some effects of steroids, you can do it with Ramirez. Maybe he was on steroids in 2008, and that's why it was his only injury-free year after turning 34. I don't buy this because there's no evidence steroids prevent injury, and we have no real reason to believe he only used steroids in 2008. After all, he failed another test in 2011. Or maybe he was on steroids his whole career, and that's why he was always such a great hitter. Of course, then steroids can't explain the hot stretch he had in 2008 because it was a constant throughout his career. But you can tell yourself a little story if you really want to. On the other hand, if you zoom out and look objectively at Manny's whole career, what you see is pretty straightforward. He was a historically great hitter who, whenever he was healthy, had seasons of between 33 and 45 home runs with an OPS plus of between 145 and 185. He often went on tears that were even better than that, and sometimes, like anyone, he had slumps and injuries where he hit worse. But he was a complicated teammate and a bad defensive player, and by the end of his career, the bad outweighed the good, so he retired before his 39th birthday. Is any of that really so strange? Do steroids help us explain any part of it? I don't think so. We know Manny Ramirez was taking banned substances, but the evidence that those substances actually affected his on-field performance is slim to none. People who think that have just been duped by Anthony Bosch's advertising and the pro-biogenesis propaganda. And yet Manny continues to serve as the bedrock example for the myth that any late career turnaround can be attributed to steroid use. But that's not even really what happened here. We're just letting our eagerness to condemn cheaters exaggerate our perception of what cheating does. In other words, it's just another steroid myth.